Good evening, dear friends. So today we have this very interesting book launching project, The Enlightened Gene. And this book primarily discusses about the dialogue or discussion between biology and Buddhism, how American scientists and Tibetan monks are transforming the ways we think about science and religion. My very good friend, Professor Arri Eisen, I had the privilege of knowing him for so many years, and he is not kind of very much, even though he speaks very less, very much into the program we have launched. And for so many years, since the Emory-Tibet Science Initiative took place in the year 2006, since then he has been a committed veteran, I call it. And not only his scholarship, but in every area where there's a possibility to extend help, he's fully behind it. And he's very much behind writing all the science books that is now used in the monasteries, writing those curriculums. He was working behind that. And then we have Geshe Yundrung Konchok, who was among the first groups who went to study for 3 years in America, study science. So while he's there, they had this very interesting idea of writing a book based on their kind of conversation. So this book is about biology and how we teach and learn it. It is about how an unusual project involving American scientists and Buddhist monks can enlighten us in teaching and learning across worldview and in general. So the two leaders of this project, one a scientist and one monk, tells the story. When we first published the first science curriculum book and handed over it to His Holiness, His Holiness then told Arri that it is education that we need. It is education that will change the world. Not meditation, not religion, but education. His Holiness the Dalai Lama requested that our new science curriculum for the monks and nuns focus on the life sciences with a special emphasis in neuroscience and physics. About a dozen professors from these areas and from Tibetan studies began meeting at Emory. Of course, we started from scratch, how to teach science to educated young men and women who know how to learn, but who know very little science or math. How much knowledge in science did the monks and nuns actually have? What aspects of Tibetan culture and history and Tibetan monastic culture can be related to this project? So there were a lot of questions. So it's an ongoing program. And as you're all aware, as we have published this little book about the process of our science initiative with Emory University and many other universities in America. And in this book we have quoted His Holiness, where His Holiness said, "I have long believed in and advocated a dialogue and cross-fertilization between science and spirituality, as both are essential for enriching human life and alleviating suffering on both individual and global levels. The Emory-Tibet Science Initiative has a unique opportunity to fulfill this need, and I'm glad to say, since that time until now, Emory science teachers have taught several thousands of monks in the monasteries. Right now, the summer, one of the workshops is taking place in South India. So during these years, many of these years has really been a success story as far as teaching science in the monasteries are concerned. So I would like to recall those opportunities and thank Arri on this occasion and for everybody who has been supporting all of you. And related to this today's topic, I found a very interesting writer by somebody. So I'm tempted to read this, just 2 lines. Becoming enlightened is a biological process in which the frontal lobes, the antenna to the divine, of the brain are being activated and the peripheral lobes close down. So you're going to speak on this. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Geshe-la, and everyone for coming. It's an honor for us to be here, and it's kind of symbolic because this project really started here as a partnership with Geshe Lhakdor and the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives working together. It's still a partnership. And the first 6 years, I guess, was here at Sarah College at the bottom of the hill, where we began experimenting in how to work together. So it's nice to be here. For those of you that were at yesterday's talk, this is a little bit different. We're not brothers, at least not in the genetic sense, but I would say that now, symbolically we're brothers, and maybe in past life we were brothers, I don't know. Also, we're not famous, we're just regular guys. I'm a teacher, Konchok's a monk, so it's also different in that way. This is just what we do every day. So the way we thought we would do today's discussion is that we would read a little bit I would read a little bit from the book and then ask Geshe-la a question, and he would answer, and then he would read a little bit from what he wrote in the book and ask me a question, and then I would answer, and we would just alternate a couple of times around some of the big questions that we try and address in the book, and then we would just open it up for questions, because whenever we talk about this project, I've talked about it all over the world, in Japan and the United States and India, there's always a lot of energy and questions. So I like to leave a lot of time for questions. So I'll just start off by saying a couple of things about how this project got started about a decade ago, maybe. So we've been coming and teaching here for many years, but also monks, through the Tenzin Gyatso Institute, monks and nuns come to Emory University in Atlanta and study there. And Konchok, my friend here, was in the first group of monks that came to Atlanta, 6 monks for 3 years. And we would meet every week and talk about science and talk about life. And Konchok and I got to be very good friends, especially. And the more we talked, the more we thought. One day we were talking over coffee, and we just realized we needed to tell the world about this story, about who we were and what we had done. So we decided we'd write a book. So that was probably 7, 8, 9 years ago. And now this book was just published. And we're going to leave 2 copies of the book in the library here for the library that we both signed. And then also this book is available wherever you buy books, on Amazon India, and maybe in the bookshop here one day. And Konchok is going to translate it into Tibetan, right? Yeah, he will try. Okay. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the book and ask Konchok a question. So this is just the prologue to the book. His Holiness wrote the foreword, and this is the prologue. And we start with a quotation from the Buddha, who said, "When the student is ready, the teacher will appear." In just my short 25-year career, biology has dramatically changed. To keep up with the breadth, depth, and amount of new knowledge generated these days, even one small corner of it is nearly impossible. But imagine entering the scene from an entirely different world, one in which you have barely a scrap of previous exposure to science in your 600-year tradition of learning. How would the nature of your learning change? The nature of the teaching? How would the science itself change? This book is about biology and Buddhism. It's about how an unusual project involving American scientists and Buddhist monks can enlighten us in teaching and learning across worldviews and in general. 2 leaders of the project, me and this guy, tell the story. So now we're moving to Dharamsala in 2011. The Dalai Lama sat before us on a big wooden chair. This was the annual audience to update him on our project teaching science to Tibetan Buddhist monks and nuns. In 2005, the Dalai Lama invited Emory University in Atlanta to develop and establish a modern science program to become part of the centuries-old curriculum of his 20,000 monastics in exile. Through his lifelong interest in science and his recent conversations with neuroscientists, he saw the great potential for alleviating suffering and enriching humanity by integrating cutting-edge science with ancient wisdom, while at the same time engaging monks and nuns in 21st century knowledge. In retrospect, I see why I was attracted to the Emory-Tibet project. The Dalai Lama and Konchok are interested in how science and medicine can help people of faith, while I am interested in how faith and belief can help people of science. In the United States, there's an idea that religion and belief, and for some, even ethics, should be excluded from science, actually excluded from the academy altogether. But this works to the detriment of scientists and science in a country where religious belief is very strong. I teach science to some of the best undergraduates in the United States, the nation's future physicians and researchers. When I ask them, say, if they believe in evolution, nearly all of them say yes. Then when I ask the same students if they believe something in addition to evolution had a role in making the human species what it is, half or more of them also say yes. So why ignore the elephant in the room? Why should scientists not address the beliefs of our students head on? Maybe teaching monks science in Dharamsala and undergraduate science in Emory is not that different. In America, we often teach across different cultures and religions, assumptions, knowledge, and experiences. In my lab are men and women who grew up in Egypt, China, India, Italy, and the United States. My students, whether I'm teaching science or ethics, undergraduates or physicians, are at least as diverse. The original hope of the Dalai Lama was that our project would integrate ideas and practices of modern science and Tibetan Buddhism, especially modern neuroscience, with ancient mind-body knowledge, to help relieve suffering in the world. At the same time, he realized monks and nuns must understand the basics of science to be effective citizens of the 21st century. We have made strides in these directions as well as into many unexpected areas, including learning across cultures and within different belief systems within those cultures. We're learning how approaching the same information with a shift in perspective can dramatically change how we explore and expand that information. Here's an irony. American scientists are often less open to the possibility that ideas from Buddhism or other religions have relevance to their work than the Dalai Lama and the monks and nuns involved in our project are open to Western science and medicine having an impact on their beliefs. And scientists are the ones who often accuse people of faith of being closed-minded and not listening to reason. Perhaps one of the legacies of the Emory-Tibet Initiative, as it expands into the monasteries and the sciences become a permanent part of the monastic curriculum, will be to provide a model for effective interaction and occasional integration between science and faith communities. Perhaps moving the discussion out of the Judeo-Christian forum, out of what we Westerners know best, will make the conversation easier. Then we can go back and apply lessons learned. So Konchok, I was wondering, thinking back to the first time we met here in Dharamsala 10 years ago, and you were sitting on the floor with the other monks, and I walked in without knowing what I was doing or what I was going to do. From that moment, and of course we've become friends since then, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you changed and as you became kind of a scientist. Maybe first how you became a monk and then how you became a scientist and how you've seen yourself change over the last decade.
Good afternoon, everyone. Before answer to your question, I thought maybe I can speak in Tibetan so I can explain very clearly because my English is not that good. But you might think so even my English is not good, but we wrote it the books in English, so you might get surprised. So, and also you said we are not.
I think your English is fine because most of the English is not.
Yeah, I'm also there's less people today, so I'm a little bit confident. And you say we are not brothers, but you said that we were a brother in past life. So I want to thankful to you, and because you believe in past life, even you are scientists. So I'm feeling very much appreciated. So, as mentioned, Geshe last mentioned that. So, actually, I was born in a border nearby Mount Kailash, and when I was 7 years old, and I came to India, and I've been to school up to 8th grade. So, when I was at the school where I've been, so at that time, it's only up to 8th grade. So after 8th grade, so I joined the monastery and I started to study the philosophy and the Buddhism. So, and before I came to Emory-Tibet Science Initiative, so I studied a little bit science when I was at school. It was just general science. And so at that time, so I was really little bit interested in learning science, and also like before I came to the initiative. So when I go somewhere and when I see something, I see as a nature, just the nature. When I see people or trees, whatever, just a nature. And when I started study science and I joined the initiative, so after that, so my view and looking at the nature, it totally changed. So when I go stroll or walk, I see something, I always thinking about the questions, why it looks like that, why some trees are tall, some are short, and why people are like, they are different peoples. And also, like, so those things, like the looking at the nature is totally changed compared to the before and right now. So, and then since I studied the science and then the way of their teaching, Western professor and Western teacher, and also I have experienced that back in the Emory University. So way of their teaching are little bit, I mean, I can say like very much different from where so our teacher teach at monastery. And so right now I'm also teaching like some I mean like back in the monastery for the junior monks. So I use the same, I'm always trying to use the method they use back in United States, and then professor who came from the United States. So this makes more, I mean, like helpful to understand, like inside of the the whatever the lesson or concept or whatever. So these things like also make me change, and then also for the students. So this is the why I will give you the example like so in the Western scientists, when they teach in the class, they not only they give the lecture, also they demonstrate, they show the demonstration and example, and also they use experiments, all those things. So I use the same the method, trying to do the same method. For example, in the physics or Western cosmology, when you talk about the formation of the universe and expansion of the universe, and then planets, expansion from each other. So they use the like balloon to demonstrate it, demonstrating the how each planet moving from each other. Same thing like when I teach like the Buddhist cosmology, especially the design of the Mount Meru, and then in middle of the middle there's Mount Meru, and then four direction there's the four continents, and then there are 7 rivers, 7 mountains. So I use the one monk in the center, and then 4 directions like each monk to represent the 4 continents, and then so several monks like with the robes sitting round, so it's representing the 7 mountains and 7 rivers like now. So that makes sense like the student very well. Otherwise, if we teach only the lecture or we give the lecture, so only the imagination, so they can't, see the real, the structure or whatever. Yes.
Whenever we talk about this project, people always ask, what do you do when there's tensions between Buddhism and science? How do you handle those? So we thought we'd give an example of that and how we address that. So we have a 6-year curriculum that all the monks and nuns are learning. They start with an introduction year, and then there's a year, and they do that in biology, in neuroscience, and in physics. So when we were piloting the second year, we were teaching the monks and nuns about cells and about genes. So I was trying to think about how do you teach something like that you can't easily see. It's hard to see genes, it's hard to see cells, it's hard to imagine what these things look like, especially if you haven't really grown up in a culture where that's part of the conversation. So I thought I would teach it through the question, are bacteria sentient? Are bacteria sentient? Which is a question we don't normally think about in the West, but of course has implications for Buddhism, because I don't have to tell most of you are Buddhists what the implications are. So we had all the monks and nuns grow some bacteria on a plate, because bacteria are everywhere. They're on their fingers and their ears, on the door handles and the toilet seat. So they just got some bacteria and they grew the bacteria, and they had to design experiments. They were also teaching the experimental method. So they had to design experiments to test whether they thought the bacteria were sentient or not, to test the hypothesis that bacteria are sentient or not. So what Konchok is going to read now is kind of his reflections in the book about the experience of trying to decide, are they sentient or not?
That's the truth. And so when the question came up, are the bacteria the sentient? So we the Buddhist monk doesn't have any ideas, so what we, the answer, we will answer. And then we collected the bacteria from the cheek and then all those things, and then we did the experiment, and then the professor and the Dr. Arri, they shown on the projector, and then they really we saw that something is moving there, towards their food, and there is some pieces that dancing, and some are moving, and
yeah,
so
we set up the bacteria so you could look under the microscope, and we projected them on the wall so you could see what was under the microscope on the wall. You could see all the little cells dancing around, and then the monks tested this idea, right?
Yeah.
By giving them sugar or something, putting some sugar on the edge of the slide, and they said, well, if the bacteria are moving towards the sugar, maybe they're sentient, right? So they could see all this happening. It was quite dramatic in this room down at Sarah College, because you could see these little cells dancing, and you could see them responding to what they were putting on the slide. So you want to read what you
yeah. So after seeing to this, the pictures, so in our groups, there's 2 groups. So I will read my what I wrote here. In our group discussion whether bacteria are sentient beings, we had 2 opinions. We were split before the experiment. I myself was thinking bacteria are not sentient. But when we saw that images the bacteria moving towards food on the wall, then I thought this was real. I thought they could be sentient. Before this, I thought just because they move and find food. This doesn't mean that they have to be sentient, but in the microscope, it looks like the cell had a purpose. After our experiment, we monks talk a lot. I thought maybe these bacteria have senses, maybe even emotion. They feel where food is. Maybe they are sentient. This was the first lab experiment we ever did. We saw the bacteria on the wall. The most of us got it then, what sentence do. In actually doing it, not just saying it, many monks changed their minds. Back in my monastery, the monks always ask, how do you do experiments? How do you use the equipment? In our own philosophy, we debate on what Buddha taught. We explore the logic of text and rationality. When you say sentence, hypothesis, experiment, analyze, monks say how. When we did this experiment, things made sense. This became strong evidence. We had some negative ideas taught to us about science, but that experiment clarified some doubt about science. Some monks didn't believe in science, but when we did this experiment, we saw this with our own eyes. A kind of truth. Not only that, the evidence really inspired us a lot. The experiment motivated us to learn more science and explore more. So when we saw that, so different ideas came up. So still I'm in doubt. So I want to ask you. So you are the scientist, and you have been like teaching science for monks and Buddhist monks for many years, and you have also studied the Buddhist, and you not only teaching monks, you met with Geshe-la and His Holiness and others, Buddhist scholars and geshes. So what you think? Are you still thinking that bacteria are sentient or not?
Good question. I should say that we spent a whole week asking this question as the monks were learning about how the cells were responding to the sugar and what are the parts of the cell and what are genes and how genes were encoding the parts of the cell. And we had them debate, Tibetan style, very dramatically, whether it was bacteria or sentient or not. And they were tearing each other's clothes and things. And so at the end of the week, everybody's sitting there and we're finished. We spent 8 days, 6 hours a day. We're all exhausted addressing this question, learning about cells and genes. So I said, all right, let's take a vote. How many of you think bacteria are sentient? How many of you think bacteria are not sentient? And it was exactly split 50-50. So I thought that was perfect. Because science is complicated, questions are complicated, and like Konchok was saying, it's a complicated question, are bacteria sentient? So I don't know, but I do know this, that the more I thought about that question, at first I was just doing it to get the monks and nuns thinking, but the more I thought about it, most scientists, all American scientists, if you ask them, are bacteria sentient? They just look at you kind of funny. And they wouldn't really care. And at first I was just doing it as a teaching tool, but then I realized it could have had dramatic influence on history, on human history, for this reason. Because the first time a human saw bacteria under the microscope was in the context of Europe in the 1600s and 1700s, a little earlier, as a causative agent for disease. So we saw the bacteria, we thought they were the cause for disease, so being the typical Western response was we just killed them. We killed all the bacteria. In fact, we spent 150 years killing bacteria. Well, come the 21st century, what do we find out? We find out that yes, we were killing the bad bacteria, but we were also killing good bacteria. And we didn't know that the good bacteria existed. We in the West didn't know the good bacteria existed. It's called the Micro Biome. We've only just discovered that since you guys were born. It turns out those bacteria are vital for our health. And now many of us scientists ironically believe that many of the awful diseases that are killing us in the West, the chronic diseases that are killing us in the West, are due to the fact that for generations we were killing bacteria, the good bacteria along with the bad bacteria. So now I think, what if we had been Buddhist scientists that discovered bacteria and thought of them as sentient? All of human history may have been different. So these aren't just philosophical, meaningless questions. How you think about science and from what cultural perspective has a very big impact on how you act, how you intervene, whether or not you intervene. We want to talk about two more big questions, and then we'll take questions from you. So the example I just gave was just one of many examples of how this project has changed us in bigger ways than just talking to each other as monks to scientists. So I wanted to give another example of how teaching monks and nuns has changed the way that I think about teaching in general. So when I started this project, I'd already been teaching for 20 years, so I thought I knew what I was doing. But now, 10 years later, I have some different ideas that were inspired by the project. So I'll just read a couple of short excerpts about that. All teaching is a kind of translation. Good teaching is good translation. To translate effectively, teachers must know their students. Before going to Dharamsala, we spent 2 years studying Tibetan Buddhist culture and talking with Tibetan monks and educators who had worked with them. How could we teach science to intelligent people who have not had a significant change in their curriculum, focused on Buddhist philosophy and ancient texts for 6 centuries? People from as different a world from ours as imaginable, a world wary of science, like Konchok was saying. How could we teach science well to people who know absolutely no math, who have never thought in terms of scientific experiments, who have rarely written a paper or been on the internet? How could we teach modern science to people who believe in reincarnation? Often we think of ideas and information being lost in translation. The number of formal and informal languages in our project with the monks and nuns, Tibetan, Hindi, English, Nepali, Kannada, Chinese, Mongolian, mathematics, neuroscience, monk, physics, is mind-boggling. Initially, the translation heaviness of the project seemed like an obstacle. So when we teach to the monks and nuns, every few sentences we have to stop. And then the translators, these wonderful translators, Paldan and Karma, you know many of them, they have to translate what we say. So at the beginning, we were thinking, how are we ever going to get through any information if we have to stop every few seconds and get it translated? But now, nearly a decade later, I see the opposite is true. At first, we bemoaned the fact that we would not be able to cover much material with the monks and nuns because we had to stop every few sentences, like I was saying. The process of translation, as it passes from the teacher's cells and organs to the monks and nuns to the translators and back again, creates time and space for reflection and deeper understanding. There's a strong feeling among the monastics that the translators are much more than technicians connecting English to Tibetan and scientists to monastics, but that they are also, quote, restless mediators, listening carefully to the teachers, explaining what they say clearly, carrying the monastics' questions to the scientists, and bringing the answers back. Our project involves a different kind of symbiosis that I do not see at first. It's late afternoon, and I'm strolling in the foothills with Dondup, one of the monks who's already fluent in English. The air is electric. We've just been up at the tree line, and as I learned later, some of the monks hadn't been in the high-altitude mountain air of their youth since they first escaped from Tibet and traveled to the monasteries in the lowlands of South India years before. They're giddy. Dondup is a big basketball fan and a devoted monk. I asked him, why is he doing this? Why, instead of focusing on his monastic studies, is he here participating in our somewhat wild pie-in-the-sky experiment, learning modern science far from his home monastery? First, he says, because the Dalai Lama thinks it's a good idea. Good answer. And then, I study modern science to understand my Buddhism better. This pulls me up short. I literally stop walking. This is the symbiosis I hadn't seen. The insight itself sounds so un-Western to me. Our project isn't about converting people. either Westerners or monks, but rather about enhancing and deepening the knowledge our students and we already have. So this is just a couple of examples how working in this project where there's this very dramatic difference between us Western scientists and these bald men and women sitting on the floor. It draws these very stark distinctions, but they turn out, what we learn turns out to be relevant to all of teaching. So for example, this idea of translation. Well, ironically, when I teach in the United States, my classes are even more diverse from even more cultures, maybe 15 or 20 different religions and cultures when I teach science. But I'd never thought about the fact that, I never thought about that. I just thought I was teaching them science, and science is true, and I'm gonna make them like me. They need to learn science. But from doing this project, I realized that that's not what I should be doing. What I should be doing is, like Don Du, he said, he's not trying to become like me, he's trying to become a better Buddhist, understand his Buddhism better by studying science, the old Nalanda tradition, to understand everybody's worldview so you can understand your own better. So I realized that's what I need to be doing in my classroom, wherever it is, whatever part of the world, is not trying to convert people to be like me, but to get them to be better versions of who they are. And that's a kind of translation. You see what I'm saying? That's a kind of translation. So you're translating your experience and your knowledge into their understanding of the world, which is a very different way of thinking about teaching, especially teaching science, than I had ever done, or most of my colleagues had ever done. So Konchok, you already addressed this a little bit. So I've talked a little bit about how this project changed me outside of the project back in the United States. But maybe you could talk a little bit more about how this project has changed you outside of the project when you go back to a Monri monastery and such.
Let me take a long breath. So you asking me difficult questions, so I ask you simple question. So let me take long breath. So it's I mean, like, it's very wide and profound question, and this same questions, like, normally, so when we go back to monastery, and then senior monks always asking, so what do you learn, like, during the workshop, science workshop? And so you have been many years, and so what makes you different, learning science, and what is help to study your the Buddhism or philosophy? So sometimes I get like answers. Sometimes it's very difficult, like, to address the answer, because if you give the answer once, I mean, like, as a Buddhist debater, like, studying dialectics, sometimes it's very hard to give the specific answer, because you have to think a lot. Because if you give a one answer and then they will debate, oh, so you said this, so then they will bring another sort of, like, so it's very difficult to give like one answer. You have to look all around, and then also you have to think a lot. So I mean, like, so as the Dundups, you mentioned, it's not, it's help to learn the Buddhist philosophy. And also for me also, I have experienced that, so learning the Western science is very, very much helpful to, to study the Buddhist philosophy. For example, in Buddhist philosophy, we talk a lot about impermanence and cause and effect and a lot of things. And so when you, especially when you, the biology, and especially the autonomic, like the biology, when you talk about the inner organs, and then so your body part, so the function of the heart is like, we say every moment we change, and then we at the same thing, like, so the functioning of the heart is also every movement and every momentary is functioning, like, if it stop functioning, then we will die. So same thing, like, through the looking at the heart function, you will understand, so how, the meaning of the impermanence. Those things, and then there are many other examples. So the lacking of the time, so I hope you will ask the question later again, like, about those questions. So that's it.
We wanted to address one more thing and then open for questions, and that is how this project has emphasized to us something we suggested already, and that is how science is different in different cultures. So in the West, especially scientists, but most students I have in the West, they just think science is right. They just think science is right, and they don't really have an understanding that science has historical and cultural story, just like any other human endeavor. In other words, who's doing the science? For example, in the last generation, as women came into science, it's changed a lot. It's changed. The sociology has changed. The questions we ask has changed. Which money is available to do science? All these things change from culture to culture. So what Konchok's going to read now is a beautiful example of this. And this is very basic. The most fundamental part of modern science is evolution. So when Darwin first presented his ideas, very nervously, by the way, to the world in 1863 or whatever it was, his ideas of survival of the fittest and natural selection went into, he was in England, and England had the British Empire, including where we are sitting now. And when his ideas went out there, they were received, and even though Darwin talked about evolution of aggression, how important aggression was and being stronger and survival of the fittest, he also talked about compassion and emotions and evolution of those things. But that's not what the society picked up on. The society at that moment was at a British Empire in the Industrial Revolution, and they said, here's the scientist telling us that bigger is stronger, empire is strong, white people can do what they want, they're big, they're strong. And a whole political movement called social Darwinism arose from Darwin's ideas. Now, keep that in your mind for a second as we listen to Konchok read about what he was seeing in his mind when he took evolution class at Emory.
So when I took the evolution class at Emory, so I learned a lot. And when I first learned the emotional states such as aggression, anger, desire, and fear are necessary from the evolutionary perspective for the survival of species, I found it challenging to accept. In Buddhism, these emotions are considered epileptic and disadvantageous, and therefore we need to remove them. So we need to renounce. In Buddhism, we saying all those things are like the five poison or whatever. We have to renounce that. But based on scientific thinking, these traits evolve and are advantageous to organism. For example, perhaps if you are more aggressive, you will be more likely to survive in the population and probably get greater access to resources. But then I saw a resolution to this challenge. Evolution does not classify traits such as this emotion as good or bad. Human culture do this. Actually, each of these emotions can be good or bad, negative or positive, depending on the situation. The negative should always be rejected and the positive adopted. So I found that when I learned the evolution theory or evolution biology, so I've seen that. So these are like sort of a cultural tension in science, Western science. So my question is in the West also there are many traditions, many religions, and many culture. And so, is there any, of course, religion, but any culture and any traditions that transcend with the Western science?
Yeah, so just to emphasize what Konchok was saying, I thought it was so striking that he had the exact opposite response that the British had to Darwin's ideas. He was like, how could these things have evolved? The Buddha said we're not even supposed to have them at all, right? And then he had the great insight that evolution's not saying what's good and what's bad. Evolution is saying this is what happens, and humans decide what's good and what's bad. But certainly, especially evolution, to answer your question, Konchok, especially teaching evolution in the southern United States, or really anywhere in the United States, where people, quote, don't believe in evolution, right? They think that God created the world, and they think that creation is independent of evolution. It's either one or the other. Creates similar kind of tensions that I was talking about, that some of my students have. They certainly, some of them will accept evolution when they need to, right, in the biology class, but then have very different ideas when they're with their families or in the church. And I don't really make an effort to judge them one way or the other. I just encourage them to not pretend that those things are not, just not to separate them in their minds, but to look and identify where the tensions are and to try and work them out, think through them, and not just pretend that that there's no tensions there. So I'm not there to tell them what's right and what's wrong. I'm there to teach them, again, to translate the ideas of science into their world, and to encourage them to think about any points of tension, to identify those points of tension, and then to think about them, not to pretend they don't exist. So those are just some ideas that we wanted to talk about, but we now open the floor for any questions you have about any of the stuff we've been talking about. Actually, tonight and tomorrow we head back down south to the monasteries to continue this project. And so we're looking forward to getting back to work teaching. But in the meantime, we'll take any questions. Oops.
Hello. Good evening, everyone, including Professor and Kishela and Kishel. And my question is that very simple, and when each time I know more and my mind become a burst, because that my simple question is that does the tree have a life? Like they have a life, but they have soul or not? And my second question is that these days more and more scientists are coming towards the religion, and especially Buddhist. Why these are changing?
Thank you for your question. And so the first simple question is for me, yes? Thank you for a simple question. So, I mean, these questions, like, it's very common. So, according to the Western science, or especially the biologists, so trees and all the plants, they have, to possess the life. And they believe, also you said this. So, to possess life, have some property like reproduce, and you can those some traits. We need it, but Buddhist perspective, so we don't say that the trees or plants have the life. So we have different definitions. So according to that definition, so we said that. So I don't need to tell the definition, but it's very quite simple. And so that, according to that definition, so we believe and we said that so trees doesn't have life, or just life. So second question is also for me? No. You. The hardest one is for you.
Well, I remember when we first started talking about plants being alive and everything, that everybody started laughing, all the monks and nuns started laughing. We were like, why is this funny? And then they explained to us that, this idea. But it kind of gets at the question we talked about earlier about sentience. So is there a difference between being alive and being sentient, or being response, having a response like to sunlight, moving to sunlight, or plants can even, if one plant gets injured, it can send out a signal to the plant next door that it's been injured, so get ready, protect yourself. You know, so it does this, plants do these complicated things, almost behaviors. So does that mean they're sentient? You know, again, it's a question, the sentience question isn't one that Western scientists would typically look at. I think a Western scientist would say plants have stimulus and response. They don't have a nervous system like we do, but they have a very kind of way of communicating. In fact, some people argue because plants can't move, that they have a more advanced, they have to be more evolutionary advanced to deal with danger. So do they have a soul? I don't know. Are they sentient? I don't know. But they, as a biologist, we can say we've shown they do all those things. So then it's up to you, I guess, as a Buddhist, to decide whether they're sentient or not. For the second question, it's related to that, right? So His Holiness said yesterday, and he said many times before, that Buddhism, we kind of cheat with Buddhism because Buddhism is more open to experience and experiment than, say, Judeo-Christian traditions, creator religions, where it is said, and this is the way it is, right? Because at least Tibetan Buddhism, or at least His Holiness says, if you can demonstrate to me that I'm wrong, then I'll change my idea. That's not a typical Judeo-Christian approach, at least in the classical sense. So it is kind of, I think that's why you might see more scientists, or why it's easier to teach monks and nuns some science maybe than maybe some other traditions. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but I think, yeah, you want to add something?
I mean, so I think it's also better to try to analyze sentence being and sentence things. So to analyze those things, those two, and first you have to know what sentence means, and so if you know what is sentence, then you analyze sentence being and sentence things. So we can say plants are sentence things, but not sentence being. So if we say the sentence being, so you can think like us or some other animals.
I want to just return a bit to your comments about translation, because the experience of translating English to Tibetan is that translation doesn't occur, of course, one word at one time. The requirement is to hear the idea, and then the translator translates an idea. Yesterday, when we had our meeting with His Holiness, he had made a comment about how the Tibetan language has a capacity to consider certain kinds of ideas uniquely. And I recognize that when you speak more than one language, that it's as if you are two people, because you are not simply translating in a classical way. You really find places where one of you, say the Tibetan you, cannot speak to the English-speaking you. You are different. There's no way to translate. And so I'm wondering, because those of us that only speak English, I wonder from the Tibetan language perspective, what questions are we not asking? What do you think we're missing because of the limitations of English? And what does Tibetan have to offer the Western scientist? What are we missing? It's a simple question.
So normally, what I think is when you are the Westerner or the English as your first language, so you never tried. Most of them never tried to learn the other second language, and so for the Tibetans and people, and then the others speak or Tibetan or Hindi or whatever, so they're always trying to learn the the English language. So what I think is also the Western scientists and Westerner, it's also better to learn Tibetan, and then not only you can get oral transmission or whatever, the teaching, and you can learn by yourself what it says in the Buddhist text or Buddhist philosophy, and you can understand more, and you can get more idea. And so as the Dunduk in the book said, and also I said, so when we started learning science, it's also very helpful to learn the Buddhist understanding. And so I hope if you learn the Tibetan, it might helpful to understand the Western science more profound, and also the Tibetan.
I should say that Geshe Lhakdor and Sandhu, Samphel, and many others, there's a big parallel project to this project, translation project, where every year there's a meeting of all great Tibetan language scholars from around the world who get together, and they talk about the science terms that are coming up in this project, and they decide on new Tibetan words to use to translate the science terms. So we're almost to the point where that's going to be available online on an app, where there'll be a new Tibetan language, if you will, that's kind of grown out of the science project. So that's an important piece of the translation. But I appreciate what you're saying. We can, when we're teaching, we can tell the difference in the monks' responses depending on who the translator is. So clearly there's something that different translators translate differently. So it's an important and complicated question, translation.
Testile Professor, I have one very important question. I really want to know what is energy. And the universe is created by energy, as scientists say. And in Tibetan Buddhism, especially in the Tantric teachings, also because I'm learning Tibetan yoga, and then you see everything is created by what we call lung, or chi, or prana, and I usually translate it as energy. And even the word Tibetan lung, it has many meanings. For example, lung, it's the air, or sometimes we say lung langsha, which means somebody get angry. It's also we use the word lung. And then lung also has basically, three different kinds of subtleties. Lung rakpa, tawa, shunta tawa, gross, subtle, and what do you call it? The most subtle one. So that's why it's quite difficult to understand, what lung or energy is. So also from the scientist's point of view, you say universe is created by energy. What do you mean by energy? The 5 elements, are they energy? Or, are there more subtle energies that you talk about, So when you talk about the body, the genes, are they created by energy? And what kind of energy? What do you mean by energy from your understanding? Thank you.
Good question, complicated question. Not the best person to answer it, but I'll give it a shot. I know that from talking to His Holiness and from talking to many physicists, that this is a place where many physicists and Buddhism come together around these ideas. Although they're not using the exact same terms, it seems that the same ideas are there about energy, everything being made of energy, nothing actually being there, but it's just a collection of energy at that point that makes this book here, but it's really energy, everything's energy. So I think there's a lot of, so I'll just say a couple of things. One is I think there's a lot of conceptual overlap. So if you read David Bohm, B-O-H-M, his conversations with His Holiness, that's what they talk about. It's a little bit beyond me, but I think they are understanding each other very well. And there's books you can read where they have a conversation. about this very thing. When we say energy in biology, or maybe Joel can talk about energy in medicine, we're thinking very specifically about ATP, about molecules, heat, things we can measure very easily in biology. And I think they're probably a result of the energy that you're talking about, but not exactly the same thing. So that's the best I can do. But the best, again, the best I've seen is these conversations with David Bohm, who's a theoretical physicist, and His Holiness, and they talk about, I think in a very striking way about these ideas. Sorry, I can't give you a better answer. Did you want to say anything about that?
It's okay.
Good afternoon, sir. My question is to Professor. Since you have been a teacher and you taught to university students in USA, and after that you have been teaching to Tibetan Buddhist monks. So what was the biggest challenge that you faced teaching towards the Tibetan Buddhist monks? And what kind of questions arise from two different students, from Buddhist students as well as the non-Buddhist students, the people that you teach? And does that those Tibetan Buddhist monks, they learn Tibetan debate system? So did that really helps you in teaching, or did that really makes you teach tough?
Well, the debating is great, and we try and bring the debate teaching technique back to the United States because it's such a great way to think about what you've been talking about and to take the other side, if you will, and challenge each other and go back and forth. So that's a great teaching tool that we use in the classroom here in India, but also in the United States. I mean, I think the challenging situations are so for example, talking about reincarnation. Something so initially so different from a biological explanation that you can't even start the conversation. Or we were talking to the monks once about evolution and how people initially thought in ancient times that things just spontaneously appeared. And they said, oh yeah, that happens in Tibet all the time. If you put leather in a drawer over the winter, then in the spring a frog comes, the leather turns into a frog. But a lot of these things, and similar things happen. There are these moments where there's disconnect, right, in every classroom, anywhere in the world, right? So the trick, I think, is not to laugh and not to dismiss that, because clearly there's some root there, right, that you want to explore more. So often those kind of things are a way into learning what we call a teachable moment, right, where you can learn more because the student has revealed something about him or herself. So for example, with the leather turning into frogs thing, we say, well, that's an interesting thing. We hadn't heard about that. Let's see if we can design an experiment to test that. Let's approach it from we're scientists, this is a science class, let's approach it from an experimental perspective. So the monks designed an experiment. They took some leather and they put it into a big plastic Coke bottle, and they put some holes in it in case the leather turned into a frog and the frog wouldn't die. And they put the bottle in a drawer a couple of years ago. And so far, no frogs. But interestingly, the day after we had that conversation, I was walking back from the guest house at Drepong into the monastery, and the monsoons had just started. And all of a sudden, all these frogs just appeared out of the ground. And I saw, aha, this is what happened, right? You could see exactly what happened. Somebody had some leather sitting on the ground or some dirt, and they threw it against the wall, and then a frog was there, right? Because that's what happened. It looked like the frogs had just appeared. Because what these frogs can do, of course, is just live underground and stop their metabolism until water comes for months or maybe years. And then it looks like they just appear. And then finally, as far as the reincarnation thing, Konchok and I were sitting having one of our conversations in Atlanta, and he was taking a class in epigenetics. And what epigenetics is how our genes respond to our environment. And recently we've discovered in the West that some of our experiences that we have, the sensitivity or the capacities and the sensitivities of those experiences, we can pass those on to our next generation. Right? So Mendel, the monk, told us that we could pass genetic material, we could pass genes on to the next generation. What we didn't know until recently is that you can also pass on sensitivity to some experiences you have on top of those genes. That's called epigenetics. Well, when Konchok and I were talking about this, we realized it sounds kind of like reincarnation. Because what reincarnation is you're passing on your karma. Your karma, your experiences are passed on. Now, of course, that's not just to the next generation. That can go to any other sentient being. But that concept of something that you experienced being passed on is now showing up in Western science. So surprisingly, even, this is what I mean by thinking, don't dismiss and laugh, because you never know what new ideas will come out. But thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for this very enlightening talk on the Enlightened Gene. And through discussion, it becomes very clear that how much more wisdom, exploration we need in any sphere that is there in the world. It's always important not to accept anything by its face value, but explore, analyze, especially in the case of subtle realities, call it mind, call it energy. For me, one of the probably easiest way to find out what is sentient, what is not sentient is go from human beings, go smaller, 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 you go up to mosquito. They're also very active, we call them sentient beings. And there are many, like bacteria, as you mentioned, which are very, very subtle, and they're also doing their job very efficiently. So from that, you can also almost conclude that if such tiny, beings can exist and function, why not smaller then? So that's why in Buddhism we have a realm which is called formless realm, which is almost like pure energy, but very much functioning. So there's a very interesting area to explore. And this problem of demarcation between what is sentient and what is not sentient has been discussed extensively during one of the Mind Lab conference. As far as I remember, they agreed that sentient being is something that can move from one place to another place in search of food or something like that. I don't remember exactly, something like that. So anyway, it's very interesting thing to explore things. But one last thing that I really would like to mention regarding, it's a story regarding the need of wisdom. So in India, there was a great teacher who was giving long teaching to his students. Then after the teaching, he told one of his students, take this book and place it in my room on the table. And then the student goes with this book and then comes back frightened, saying that there is a snake near your table. Then the teacher said, okay, no problem, I'll give you some mantra to recite. And then go there and keep the book on the table. So by reciting this mantra, he goes there, still comes back frightened, saying that I recited your mantra, it didn't work. Then the teacher says, take this lamp and put the book on the table. He goes there and then he realizes there's no snake, it's just coil of rope. You see? So with this is a wonderful story to show that we can really see the reality properly with the light of wisdom, not through mantra or any other things. So thank you very much for sharing this light of wisdom. And I would like to thank you with these small gifts.
Just as a reminder, we're giving these 2 books to Geshe La to keep in the library here if you're interested in reading it, or it's available in any website that sells books.